You will regret this." The Duke of Rydale said it without turning his head, his lips scarcely moving, as the rector drew breath over the open prayer book between them. The chapel was warm with the press of July and the press of 200 curious bodies, and the light came down through the south windows in long gold bars that fell across the altar rail and the toes of her borrowed slippers. The air smelled of hot wax and crushed rose, and the particular dust of an old stone church baking in summer, and under it, very faint, the sweat of a crowd that had dressed in its best and walked too far in the heat to see a duke made wretched. Eleanor Hartwell lifted her chin a half-inch and looked at the carved screen ahead of her, where a stone saint had been holding up the same 2 stone fingers for 400 summers. "I have regretted worse," she said, and smiled. It was not the smile a bride was supposed to wear. She felt the rector's glance flick to her and away. She felt, too, the small stiffening in the man beside her, a shift of weight, a tightening at the jaw she could see only at the edge of her vision, the broad line of his shoulder going rigid under the dark blue superfine of his coat. He had not expected to be answered. Men of his rank were not, as a rule, answered, and certainly not at the altar, and certainly not by a ruined physician's daughter who had come to her own wedding in a gown 3 years out of fashion that her aunt had let out twice at the seams. A bee had got in through the propped vestry door and was working the white roses banked along the rail, and its drowsy industry was the loudest sound in the chapel until the rector found his place again. The vows went on. Somewhere a fan ticked open and shut. Somewhere a child was hushed. Eleanor heard her own voice make the responses, low and even. The voice she had learned in worse rooms than this. Sick rooms, debtors' parlours, the back kitchen of a Bath lodging house where she had counted out a stranger's medicine by the light of one tallow stub, the fat of it stinking and guttering while a man 2 doors down coughed the night away. To have and to hold. She had held a great many things in 3 years. She did not flinch from words. When it came to him, the Duke's voice was a thing of cold, beautiful carrying. He gave each word its full weight, as a man pays a debt he resents to the last farthing, and the resentment was for her, and she knew it, and she stood in the gold light and let it fall over her like rain off a good cloak. The stone under her slippers was cool through the thin soles. The roses were going over in the heat and shedding a petal now and then onto the worn brasses underfoot. She was permitted, at the last, to glance at him. She had been told he was handsome, and the report had been mean with the truth. He was tall enough that the rector had to look up at him, and built across the shoulders like a man who rode hard and rode harder. The kind of frame that made tailors weep with gratitude, and other men stand a little straighter. His hair was dark and close, his face all clean, hard planes, his eyes the grey of slate under rain. He was 27, and looked as though he had not laughed since the spring. The thumb of his right hand turned the heavy gold signet on his 4th finger, once, around and back, as though he was screwing something down. "Then I pronounce," said the rector, with audible relief, "that they be man and wife together." The bee found the open door and was gone. Somewhere behind her, a woman wept the easy tears of weddings, and somewhere, a man coughed into his fist, and the organ began with a wheeze and a swell, and Julian Bardell, 8th Duke of Rydale, turned and offered Eleanor his arm as though offering her the hilt of a blade. She took it. His forearm was iron under her gloved hand, and warm through the cloth, and she felt the held tension running all down it, the locked strength of a man enduring a thing he could not be seen to mind. "Smile, Your Grace," she said, low, under the organ. 200 people have come to see you, wretched. Disappoint them. For one beat, one single beat, before the mask came down again, something moved behind the slate-grey eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of a thing he had forgotten he owned. Then they walked down the aisle together into the white summer glare, and the bells of St. Edith's broke over the valley in a great, unruly clamour, and the Duke of Rydale did not smile. but he did not let her hand go either. Rydale Abbey sat in its green bowl of Somerset Hills, like a thing grown there rather than built, all warm grey stone and mullioned glass, with a long lavender walk running south from the terrace down to the lake. By the time the wedding breakfast had emptied of the last well-fed neighbour and the last creaking carriage had ground away down the avenue, the light had gone amber, and the swifts were screaming in high circles over the chimneys, and Eleanor stood alone at the end of the lavender walk with her slippers in her hand and her bare feet on the warm gravel, and breathed. The smell of the lavender came up at her in waves as the heat went out of the day, that dusty, resinous, drowsy sweetness, thick enough to lie down in. The gravel held the day's warmth still, and gave it back into her soles. Somewhere off in the stable yard, a bucket rang on stone, and a man laughed at something. The ordinary sounds of a great house letting its breath out after a long day of behaving. She had not smelled lavender in any quantity since Bath. She closed her eyes and let it take her where it wished. And when she opened them again, the Duke was standing 20 feet off at the head of the walk, watching her, a glass of something untouched in his hand. "My wife," he said, "goes barefoot in her own garden on her wedding night. The county would be enthralled." "The county has gone home." She did not pick up her slippers. "And I have washed finer feet than mine in colder water than your lake. I think the lavender will survive me." He came down the walk toward her, unhurried, his boots quiet on the gravel, and the low light caught the side of his face. There was a small white line through his left eyebrow that she had not seen in the chapel, an old, healed nick, and she catalogued it without meaning to, the way she catalogued everything, the way 3 years of needing to know exactly what she was dealing with had wired into her bones. "You answered me," he said, "at the altar. No one answers me." "You spoke to me. I find it discourteous to leave a man talking to himself in front of the bishop." "It was not the bishop. It was the rector." "Then he will not have minded so much." The corner of his mouth did something complicated and gave it up. He stopped a careful arm's length from her, and the lavender stood between them up to their hands, and a late bee bumbled over the spikes, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than she had hoped for. "Understand me, Miss Hartwell." He stopped. "Your Grace. I must learn to say it. Understand me." The signet turned once, around and back. "This marriage was not my choosing. My father's hand made it, and my father's hand is... My father is no longer here to be reasoned with. He bound me to it before he went, and I keep my given word, even the words others give in my name. But I will not pretend to you in private what I performed for them this morning." He looked at her levelly. "I do not love you. I do not know you. I resent the necessity of you. I would rather have it plain between us than dressed up. You strike me as a woman who would rather the same." The honesty of it was almost a kindness, and she recognized the almost, and respected the man for the part that was, and pitied him for the part that was not. "Plain, then," she said. "I will keep your house. I will keep your name from any further harm than it has already taken in marrying me. I will not embarrass you, and I will not pine after you. And I will not lie awake hoping you have changed your mind, because I have spent 3 years learning precisely how little hoping is worth." She set her slippers down on the gravel and stepped into them, one foot and then the other, unhurried, while he watched. "And I will tell you one thing for nothing, Your Grace, since we are being plain. You said I would regret this. You were warning me off, as though you were the worst thing that might happen to a woman in this life." She straightened. "You are not even close." She walked past him up the lavender walk to the house, and she did not look back to see his face, and the swifts screamed overhead. Behind her, very quietly, she heard him say her name once. Eleanor. As though testing the shape of it in his mouth, as though it were a word in a language he had once known and forgotten. The household of Rydale Abbey had been managed for 29 years by Mrs. Pell, who had buried 2 masters and a mistress, raised the present duke from a long-legged boy who fell out of the cedar, and who regarded the arrival of a ruined merchant's daughter as the 8th duchess, with the flat, assessing calm of a woman who had seen worse weather and expected to see it again.
"Breakfast at 9, Your Grace,"
she said, on the first full morning, standing in the doorway of the morning room with her keys at her belt and her hands folded over her apron. The room smelled of beeswax and cut grass, and the small, bitter ghost of last night's snuffed candles. Unless you keep town hours, in which case we shall accommodate, though I will say the kitchen prefers an early lady. His Grace rides at 6 and breakfasts at 7:30, alone, and has done since he was old enough to be trusted with a horse, and no one has yet talked him out of it, so I'll not raise your hopes. I keep early hours, Mrs. Pell. I've spent 3 years rising before fires were lit. I should not know what to do with a town morning. Something passed over the housekeeper's face. Not warmth, not yet, but the first faint loosening of a held breath. "Aye," she said. "I had heard you were not afraid of work. We shall see whether the heard of and the true are the same article. They so seldom are." "They so seldom are," Eleanor agreed. "You will find me the exception, or you will find me out. Either way, you will know within the month, and I would not insult you by asking you to decide sooner." The housekeeper looked at her a moment longer. The keys shifted at her belt with a small, dull music. Then she inclined her head a careful 1/4 inch, the precise depth, Eleanor would learn, that Mrs. Pell reserved for things that had passed a first test, and said, "There is bread still warm if you'll come now," and turned. And that was the beginning of that. The bread was warm, and the butter was cold and salted, and stood up in a yellow round on a blue dish, and Eleanor ate it standing at the long window, because she had not yet learned to sit at her own table without feeling she was sitting in someone's place. Out on the gravel sweep below, a groom walked a tall grey horse up and down, and presently the Duke came out to it in his riding things, swung up without touching the block, and was gone down the avenue at a hard, collected canter before the dew was off the grass. He had not glanced at the house. A man may live in a great warm house, she thought, watching the grey diminish under the limes, and ride out of it every morning of his life as though it were a place he had been quartered against his will. It was the Duke's sister who turned out to be the true weather of the house. Lady Sophie Bardell was 19, dark like her brother, and not at all grave like him, with a laugh that came up out of her like water out of a pump, and a habit of appearing in doorways with her bonnet ribbons untied and her hands full of something. A kitten, a fistful of stolen sweet peas, a novel she was not supposed to be reading. She found Eleanor in the long gallery on the second morning, blew into the room like the south wind with the smell of the garden still on her, and stopped dead 3 feet away to look at her new sister with frank, glittering, delighted appraisal. "You're the one who answered him at the altar," she said. "Pell told me. Pell tells me everything. She only pretends to be discreet. It's all theatre. Is it true? Did you truly say you had regretted worse?" "I did." "To his face? At the rail?" Lady Sophie sat down very suddenly on a window seat, as though her legs had given out from joy, and a sweet pea fell from her fist and lay on the polished boards like a small pink scandal. "Oh, I am going to love you. I have wanted someone to stand up to him for years." "Have the candidates been many?" "They have been none. That is the whole tragedy of it. People come and bow and scrape and call him Your Grace in voices like cold gravy, and he gets greyer and greyer, and they go away and tell each other how dignified he is in his grief." She wrinkled her nose. "He has been perfectly unbearable since Papa. Well, since the spring. He goes about like a man carrying a wardrobe up a hill and won't set it down and won't let anyone help him with it. And if you say so, he looks at you as though you'd suggested he'd take off his boots in church." "And does no one say so?" "I say so. Pell says so, in her way, which is to bang the coal scuttle. It glances off him like rain off a window. Lady Sophie leaned forward, ribbons trailing. You will not let him do that to you, will you? You will not let him make the whole house grey. I have a constitutional objection to grey, Eleanor said. It does not suit my colouring. Lady Sophie laughed her pump-water laugh, bright and sudden in the long room, and for the first time since the bells of St. Edith's, Eleanor felt something in her chest that was not entirely braced. But that afternoon, a letter came for the Duke, under a seal Eleanor did not know, brought up on the silver tray by the under-butler, and she watched from the gallery window as her husband took it on the terrace below and read it standing. He went very still. He turned the signet ring on his finger once, around and back, and folded the letter very small, and put it into his breast pocket as a man hides a wound. And when he came in to dinner that evening, there was a name on the table she had not heard before, because Lady Sophie said it, lightly, over the soup. Has Mr. Vane written? Pell said a letter came with his seal. And the Duke set down his spoon with great care against the rim of the dish, so that it made no sound at all, and said, Mr. Vane's correspondence is not a subject for the dinner table, Sophie. In a voice that closed the matter like a lid. Eleanor filed the name away, with the white scar through his eyebrow, and the slate-grey eyes, and the wardrobe he would not set down. Vane. She would learn what it meant. She always learned, in the end, what things meant. It was the only inheritance her ruin had left her, and she had grown not to despise it. The trouble between them, in those first weeks, was not cruelty. He was never cruel. The trouble was that the Duke of Rydale had decided who she was before he met her, and a man who has decided a thing will spend a great deal of ingenuity not noticing the evidence against it. He believed she had married him for the dukedom, for the warm grey stone, and the lavender walk, and the carriages, and the credit at every shop from Wells to London. It was not an unreasonable thing to believe of a woman 3 years in service, whose father had lost a fleet to the bottom of the sea. It was simply wrong. And being wrong, it required of him a continual small effort, a permanent slight squint, that she could see costing him by the week. She set herself to learning the house meanwhile, because a house is a body, and tells you where it hurts if you put your hands on it honestly. She walked the cellars with the candle, and found the damp coming up the north wall where a drain had silted. She stood in the great cold kitchen at 5 in the morning, while the fires were laid, and learned the cook's name, which was Mrs. Tranter, and her gout, which was bad, and her opinion of the undercook, which was worse. She mended the linen room's broken system of counting sheets, so that the laundry no longer lost a pillow slip a week to nobody. None of it was Duchess's work. All of it was the work she knew, and the doing of it steadied her. And by slow degrees, the servants stopped going quiet when she came into a room, and began instead to bring her things: a question, a complaint, a dead mouse in a flower bin held out for judgment, which is the only true coronation a great house offers. Once, passing the open door of the gun-room, she found the Duke cleaning a fowling piece he plainly had no intention of firing, simply to have something in his hands. And she stood a moment, unseen, and watched him at it, the oiled rag going up and down the barrel with the same slow attention he gave the rector's vows. And she thought, here is a man who does not know what to do with his own hands when no one needs anything of them. It was not contempt, she felt, watching him. It was the first cousin of tenderness, and it frightened her more than contempt would have done, and she went on down the passage without speaking. It came to a head over the chimney money. She had taken the household books from Mrs. Pell, gently, by degrees, the way one takes a heavy thing from a tired person without making a point of it. And inside a fortnight, she had found, where the books met the estate ledgers, a leak. Not large, a few pounds a quarter, going out under sundry repairs to the south chimneys since the previous autumn, the south chimneys having been, as far as Eleanor could discover by the simple expedient of walking out across the dew-wet grass and looking at them, in no need of repair whatsoever. The pots stood sound and sooted against the morning sky. No mortar had been new-pointed there in 20 years. A jackdaw had built unmolested in the nearest. She brought it to him in the library, where he sat most evenings now with a single branch of candles and a book he did not turn the pages of, and she laid the 2 ledgers open before him on the desk and put her finger on the line. The candle smell was warm, and the leather of the books was cool, and a moth had got in and was knocking itself softly against the glass of the lamp. "Your south chimneys have cost you £11 since Michaelmas," she said, "and they are sound as bells. Someone is mending them on paper and pocketing the mortar." He looked at the line. He looked at her. And she watched the squint come into his face, the decided thing reasserting itself, and she knew what he would say before he said it. "And you found this," he said, "within a fortnight of laying your hands on my accounts." "Within a fortnight of having nothing better to do than read them, yes." "How fortunate." His voice had gone smooth and cold, the altar voice. A woman comes into a house she has no history in, and inside 2 weeks she has discovered exactly where the money is and exactly who may be touching it, and brings it directly to me. One might almost think she had been schooled to know where to look. Eleanor took her finger off the ledger and straightened, and the candle flames bent in some draught and stood up again, and she let the insult sit in the air long enough that they both heard it fully. "One might," she said, "if one were determined to think the worst of a person, and to call that determination good sense. Hear me, Your Grace, because I will only trouble to say it the once." She closed the ledger, and the soft clap of it was loud in the quiet room. "I was schooled to know where to look by 3 years of feeding 11 people on what 8 could not have lived on, in a house where every farthing that went astray was a farthing off the table. I learned to read a tradesman's book the way you learned to read a horse, because my survival was in it, and a thing you survive by, you learn whether you will or no." She set her hand flat on the closed cover. "I did not come here knowing your chimneys. I came here knowing that men who steal small steal from the part of the page no one reads. Your steward's man reads no part of any page. He writes it. There is your thief." She picked up the 2 ledgers and squared their edges against the desk, exact, the corners flush. "You may sack him or keep him. It is your £11. But do not ever again suggest I am clever in a way that ought to frighten you, when the only thing my cleverness has ever bought me is the right to clean up after men too proud to count." She left the books on his desk and walked out, and her heart was going hard, and the corridor was cold after the warmth of the library, and she was halfway up the stair with her hand on the banister rail before she let herself feel how much she had wanted, for one moment in there, for him simply to have said, "Thank you." He sacked the steward's man within the week. He did not apologize. But the next quarter's books came to her unasked, left on the morning room table in his own hand, and on the top of them, weighted with a smooth grey riverstone so the breeze through the open window should not take it, a single half-sheet on which he had written, "The chimneys, it seems, were a fiction. I am told you read fictions well." Ah. It was not an apology. It was, she understood, the nearest thing to one that the man yet knew how to make. She kept the half-sheet folded in the small box that held everything that was truly hers, and she did not tell him she kept it. But she found, going down to breakfast the next morning, that she had set the grey riverstone on her own windowsill, where the early sun came at it, and she let it stay. There came after that a thawing so slow she could not have put her finger to the day of it. He took to riding home by the lavender walk instead of the avenue, and once she was out among the spikes with a basket, and he checked the grey, and looked down at her without dismounting, and said only, "It does well this year." And she said, "Your father planted it, I'm told," and watched something cross his face, and he rode on. But he had stopped to say it. He began to ask her things at dinner that were not about the running of the house. What she thought of the war news, of a sermon, of whether a tenant's boy ought to be sent to school at the estate's charge. He listened to the answers with the grave, full attention she had seen him give the rector's vows, turning each one over and sometimes taking it, and sometimes not, but always as though her judgment were a real weight on a real scale. Lady Sophie watched all this from under her trailing ribbons, with the bright, unsubtle hope of a girl who has read too many novels, and Eleanor was careful, very careful, not to hope along with her. The fever came to Coombe Hollow in the last week of July, in the worst of the heat, when the river ran low and green, and the cottages down by the mill stood in their own still air. Eleanor heard of it from the laundry-maid before any word reached the Duke, because trouble runs upward through a household slower than it runs sideways, and by the time it had reached him, she had already had the gig put to, and a basket packed with what the still-room could spare: willow bark, vinegar, clean linen, a stone bottle of barley water sweating cold in the straw. He came out onto the terrace as she was climbing up, in his shirt sleeves, with his coat over his arm, and the morning sun was hard and white on the lavender, and the bees were already loud in it. "Where are you going?"
Coombe Hollow. There is sickness at the mill cottages. 3 children down, and the muse-woman near her time, and the apothecary at Wells is 2 days' ride from Sense and a week from sober.
She gathered the reins.
I have nursed fever before. I know what it wants and what it does not. I am no use to you embroidering in a hothouse while your people sweat it out in the bottoms.
He looked at her for a moment. The light was full on him, and she could see the small muscle work in his jaw, and the decided thing in his eyes, trying, for once, to decide something new. Then he put on his coat, and came down the steps, and got up into the gig beside her without a word, and took the reins out of her hands. "You will not drive into a fevered village alone," he said, "while I keep the embroidery. Move over." The road down to the hollow ran between high hedges, loud with the dry stridulation of grasshoppers, and the dust rose up behind the wheels and hung gold in the still air, and the heat came off the chalk of the lane in a shimmer. The mill cottages, when they reached them, were low and dark, the thatch grey and the doors low, and the air inside the first of them was thick enough to chew. The close animal heat of sickness, sweat and tallow, and the sourness of a sick room shut up against a draught that the country still believed killed quicker than the fever did. Eleanor had been in worse. She had been in much worse, but she watched the Duke duck under the lintel of the Mews cottage and stop, just for a heartbeat, at the wall of heat and smell and human trouble, the way the soft-handed always stopped. And then she watched him go on in, and she revised something about him in the back of her mind by a small but permanent degree. He was not soft-handed after the first hour. She gave him work, because work is the only mercy in a fevered house, and he did it. He carried water from the cold spring up the hill, till his fine shirt clung grey to his back, and the linen went transparent with it. He held a thrashing boy of 7 still against his chest, while she got the willow bark draught past the child's clenched teeth, and murmured to him some nonsense about a pony, low and steady, that Eleanor would not have thought him capable of. And when the Muse-woman's hour came on her, in the dark heart of the night, he sat by the bed and gave her his hand to break, and she broke it nearly to splinters through the long, roaring middle of it, and he did not so much as change his face. Eleanor and the old midwife brought the child into the world by the light of 2 candles and the first grey come-up of dawn at the unshuttered window, and the new son cried his thin, furious cry, and the mother laughed and wept at once, and the Duke sat looking at his own crushed hand as though it belonged to a stranger. When it was done, when the new child was washed and at the breast, and the worst of the fever had broken in the 3 down with it, and they slept the deep, wet sleep of the turned corner, the 2 of them walked out into the cool of the very early morning. The mist was lying along the river in long white ribbons, and the first light was coming up gold behind the beeches, and the grass was soaked with dew to the knee, and somewhere a blackbird had begun, careless and liquid, as though no one in the valley had been near to perishing at all. The Duke of Rydale leaned on the cold cottage wall with his ruined shirt and his bruised hand, and looked at the river as though he had not seen one before. "I have lived 9 miles from this village my whole life," he said. "I did not know the spring was cold."
There is a great deal a duke is not required to know about his own springs.
No, He turned his head and looked at her, and there was grime on his face and exhaustion in the slate-grey eyes, and something else, something newly arrived and not yet named. There is not. That is rather the difficulty with being a duke. He was quiet a moment. The mist moved on the water, then, looking back at the river, perfectly grave. I find I have delivered a child, ruined a shirt, and been informed by a 7-year-old that I hold a cup like a girl. I'd understood marriage would expand my horizons. I had not understood it would do so before breakfast. It was so dry and so sudden, and so entirely unexpected from that grave, cold mouth, that Eleanor laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, startled out of her, the first in that valley. And it rang out over the misted water and set the blackbird off again. And the Duke looked at her, laughing in the gold morning with the river at her back, and something in his face came open, like a window in a shut house. "There," he said, more quietly. "I had begun to think you only smiled to frighten clergymen." "I smile at competent men. It is a narrow field, Your Grace. You have just enlarged it by one." "By one," he repeated. He looked down at his broken hand and flexed it, gingerly, and winced, and seemed obscurely pleased to have come by an honest hurt. "I shall have it set, and tell everyone I came by it boxing. No one would believe the truth of it, that the Duke of Rydale was undone, in a single night, by a midwife, a brat with sharp opinions, and his own wife." He paused. "I find I do not greatly mind which of the three did the most damage." The mist burned off the river as they drove home, and neither of them spoke much. In the silence this time was the good kind, the kind that does not need filling. When they came up the avenue, Lady Sophie ran out to meet them, and stopped when she saw their faces, both of them, the grime and the tiredness, and the thing that had changed. And she did not tease, for once, but only took the basket out of Eleanor's hands and walked in between them. And Eleanor thought, "Here is a thing I will have to be careful of. Here is a thing that could hurt." After Combe Hollow, the house was warmer, and she let herself feel it the way one lets oneself feel the sun on the back of the neck, gratefully, and without turning round to look at it directly, lest it prove to be a trick of the light. He had his hand set by the bone setter at Wells, and wore it strapped for a fortnight, and was clumsy with it at table, and made dry, small jokes against himself when the strapping defeated a fork, and Lady Sophie crowed over him, and the dinners grew loud in a way the servants plainly had not heard in that room for a year. He came to breakfast now and then at Eleanor's early hour, his hair still wet from washing, and ate standing at the window as she did, and they fell into the habit of dividing the morning's business between them over the cooling chocolate, the wall to be moved, the tenant's petition, the London letter, as though they were two people who had agreed to manage a thing together, rather than two people a clause had locked in a room. Once she came on him in the library, not staring at a book but reading it, his strapped hand turning the pages awkwardly, and he looked up and said, "Sit, if you like. You needn't talk. I find I no longer object to being in a room with you." Which, from him, she had learned to translate, and the translation made her have to look hard at the spines on the far shelf for a moment before she trusted her face. She found him one wet afternoon, for the heat had broken at last in a warm grey rain that drummed on the leads and ran the gutters full and brought up the green smell of the soaked garden through every open window. In the small south study that had been his father's, with a great battered book open on the table before him and his head in his hands. It was an herbal. She knew the kind at once. The thick rag paper, the hand-coloured plates, the wide margins crowded with a small slanting brown ink hand. He looked up when she came in, and did not, for once, smooth his face over. The rain ran loud overhead, and the room smelled of old paper and damp stone, and the particular cold of a hearth not lit since spring. "My father's," he said. "His garden book. He wrote in all of them. I have been—" The signet turned once. "I cannot read his notes without hearing his voice, and I cannot stop reading them. It is a foolish way to pass a wet afternoon." "It is not foolish." She came and stood at his shoulder and looked down at the open page. lavender, lavandula, the spikes finely engraved, and around them the small brown hand running close. Cut on the second dry day after midsummer, when the lower florets open, and before the bee has all the good of it. The south walk does best, the soil being light. And lower, in the same hand but smaller, crabbed, later, the letters less sure. E says wait for the bee to have his share. There is always enough. She is right, as in most things. Keep this leaf. Eleanor went very still. Pressed flat into the gutter of the page, brown now and brittle, but holding still its grey-purple ghost, was a single sprig of lavender. She knew the hand. She had watched it write. She had steadied the wrist that held the pen, in a Bath lodging house in the cold end of the winter, when the old Duke's fingers had grown too weak to make the letters, and he had insisted, on copying out his garden notes one last time. Because, he said, a man should leave his sons something better than money, and money was all he was afraid he had. She had read the lavender plate aloud to him while he wrote, her finger under the line, the candle between them, the window white with Bath fog. She had told him to leave the bee his share. E says. E for Eleanor. She had not known he had kept the leaf. Your Grace, she said, and her voice was not quite her own, and she was glad his eyes were on the book and not her face. Who is E? I do not know. He ran his thumb along the edge of the page, not touching the brittle sprig. Someone at Bath, I think. He went to Bath that last winter for the waters, for his chest. He stopped. I did not go to him. I was in town. There was always a reason I was in town. A vote, a friend, a horse. God forgive me, a horse. He wrote that there was a person who read to him and argued with him about his garden, and I thought it some old physician's notion, some companion the lodging-house provided, and I— His jaw worked. I never asked her name. He is full of her in these last pages, and I never once asked her name. And now there is no one left to ask. The rain ran in the gutters. Eleanor stood with her hand on the back of his chair, and the whole shape of the thing she carried stood up in her like a second person in the room. She could have told him. The words were there, behind her teeth. I am E. It was I who read to him. He chose me for you because I told him to leave the bee his share. She could have laid it down on the table between them like the ledgers. She could have drawn out the letter his father had pressed into her hand that last winter at Bath. The letter she carried still, sealed and soft against her, kept back until she should judge the moment right to give it him, and let the old man tell his son the rest in his own hand. And she did not. And the reason she did not was not cowardice, though it wore cowardice's coat. It was that she had seen, 3 weeks running, what a single careless word from her could do to the squint behind his eyes. He believed she had married him for the dukedom. If she told him now that she had sat at his father's side, that his father had loved her, that the whole machinery of this marriage had run through her hands before ever it touched his, he would not hear a daughter's tending. He would hear a schemer. He would hear exactly what Mr. Vane, whoever Mr. Vane was, would want him to hear. And the warmth in the house, the new, fragile warmth, not 3 weeks old, would go out like a candle in the rain. Not yet, she told herself. When he knows you, when the knowing is strong enough to carry the secret, then. I am sure she was fond of him, she said instead, and her voice came out steady. Whoever she was. Men do not write she is right. As in most things of women, they merely tolerate. No, he said, looking at the brittle leaf. I suppose they do not. I think. He shut the book softly, keeping his place with one finger. I think she made his end a kinder thing than I did. That is not a comfortable thing to know about oneself. I find I would rather know it than not, which is new in me, and I believe I have you to thank for it, and I do not entirely thank you. Thanks of that kind keep best unspoken, she said,
Leave it on the shelf, Your Grace. It will not spoil.
She left him with the book, and out in the passage, with her back against the cool plaster and the rain loud overhead, Eleanor pressed her thumb hard into the small white seam of an old scar on her palm, the burn the bath grate had given her, reaching past it for the kettle the night the old Duke could not sleep. And she stood there a long moment. Then she went and saw about the dinner, because the dinner did not care what she carried, and there was a kind of mercy in that, too. Mr. Selwyn Vane came to Rydale Abbey on the first cool morning of August, and he came in a very good carriage. Eleanor saw him handed down from it on the gravel, a slim, fair, exquisitely turned-out man of perhaps 35, beautiful in the cold, polished way of a marble that has been kept indoors, with pale eyes and a mouth made for the saying of reasonable, ruinous things. The gravel did not seem to mark his boots. He had been the old Duke's man of business these dozen years, she would learn within the hour, and had expected, everyone had expected, to go on being the new Duke's, and had not reckoned on a wife who could read a ledger. He sat in the drawing-room and took tea, and was charming to Lady Sophie, and grave with the Duke. And to Eleanor he was so very, very courteous, that the courtesy itself was the threat. The way a drawn sword laid flat on the table between two men is a threat. The cup looked small in his pale, exact hands. He took no sugar. "Your Grace is fortunate," he said to Julian, but with his pale eyes resting on Eleanor, "in a wife of such practical gifts. I am told she has quite overhauled the household accounts. Remarkable in a lady new to the position. Remarkable how quickly she has made herself—" the smallest pause, like a man choosing a card. "Indispensable. One does so admire a woman who knows the value of a thing." "My wife," said the Duke, "knows the value of a great many things, Vane, including, I begin to suspect, the value of the work you have not been doing. The South Chimneys, for instance." A flicker, very small, across the marble. "An oversight in the steward's office, Your Grace. Since corrected, I am glad to—" "Since corrected by her. Yes." The Duke set down his cup, and the small chime of china was very distinct in the room. "We are aware." Eleanor watched Mr. Vane absorb that, and repack it, and smile, and she thought, "There is my enemy then," with the flat clarity of a woman who had had enemies before and knew the species. He had had the running of this estate, and its purse, and its secrets for a dozen years. And a clever wife was a window opening on a room he had liked dark. He would not forgive it. And he had something. She saw it in the very smoothness of him, the way a card player's stillness tells you he holds the trick. He had something he was keeping. Some card he had not yet turned. He turned a corner of it before he left. He found her alone for one moment in the gallery, as the carriage was being brought round, by the simple art of being where she was. He stood close, and spoke low and pleasant, looking at a portrait of some long-gone bardel, and not at her at all. And the smell of him was cold and clean, orris root and good linen. The smell of a man who has never once carried water up a hill. "You read to the late Duke at Bath," he said, "in Mrs. Cobbold's lodging-house in Trim Street that last winter. He called you in his letters to me. I have all his letters, Your Grace. A man of business keeps everything." He turned his pale eyes on her at last, and smiled with great gentleness. "What a very long way you have come in so very little time. From reading to a failing old man for your bread, to being the lady of his house. One might write quite a story with those two facts and a little ink. One might even believe it." He inclined his head, a beautiful courtesy. "I do so look forward to furthering our acquaintance." And he was gone, down the stair, into the good carriage, away down the avenue, the wheels grinding small in the gravel, and then fading under the limes. And Eleanor stood in the gallery, with the long-gone bardel looking down at her, and understood, very precisely and without panic, the shape of what was coming. He knew. He had the letters, and he meant, when it suited him, to take the truest, tenderest thing she had ever done, sit with a frightened old man through his last bad winter, and dress it as the long game of a fortune hunter, and lay it before her husband in just enough ink to be believed. She had until he chose his moment. She did not know how long that was. She knew only that the secret she had meant to give Julian gently, in its own good time, when the knowing was strong enough to carry it. That secret was now a loaded thing in another man's hand, and the choosing of the moment had been taken away from her. And the only question left was whether she could reach her husband with the truth before Mr. Vane reached him with the falsehood. She did not sit idle under it. That was not in her either. In the days that followed, she went quietly to work on what she could touch, which was the books, because a man who steals a story is very often a man who has also stolen money, and the two thefts lie close together in a ledger, if one knows the part of the page no one reads. She had the old account rolls up from the muniment room, a dozen summers of them, foxed and smelling of mouse and tallow, and she sat over them late with a single candle, while the moths came and went at the glass, and she found, by patience, the shapes of other fictions than the chimneys. A roof at the home farm, reslated 3 separate times in 4 years. A drainage that had been paid for twice. A dead man kept a 12-month on the wages book under the name of a labourer who had gone to Canada. None of it large. All of it veins. A man who bleeds in a state £11 a quarter through a chimney does not stop at a chimney. She did not take it to Julian. Not yet. A wife who comes to her husband with evidence against the man who is about to accuse her looks precisely like a wife who is frightened of being accused. She copied it instead, in her own clear hand, every figure and every date, and she sealed the copy and gave it into the keeping of the one person in that house no one would think to question, Mrs. Pell, who took the packet without a word and put it somewhere about her formidable person and said only, "I have kept worse for the family than papers, Your Grace, and told fewer lies about it than you'd credit." And Eleanor understood that she had, in some manner she had not earned and could not name, been adopted. For 9 days after that, nothing. It was the cruelest thing Vane could have done, and she suspected he knew it. He did nothing and let her wait. And the waiting was its own slow fever. And in those 9 days, because the world is built without mercy or with too much, she was never sure which, those 9 days were the best she had ever known. The lavender came ready for cutting on the second dry day after a wet spell, just as the old Duke's book had said, and Eleanor went down the south walk in the gold early light with the gardeners and a great flat trug, and the dew was still on the lower stems, and the bees were not yet up in their numbers, and the scent came off the cut spikes thick enough to swim in. The Duke came too, in his shirt sleeves, his hand unstrapped now, and only a little stiff, and they cut the lavender together, while the first bees protested, and the swifts went over, and the church clock at the village told the quarters across the fields. "The book says to leave the bee his share," she said, snapping a stem so that the resin smell jumped up sharp between them. "Your father's hand. E says wait for the bee. I'm inclined to side with E. E is forever telling me what to do, through my father, from beyond Bath." He cut a spike and turned it in his bruised, healed fingers, and the grey-purple heads shed a little dust of scent onto the back of his wrist. "I find I've come round to her entirely. It is a humbling thing to be ruled by a woman whose name one does not know." "Perhaps you know her better than you think," Eleanor said, low, to the lavender, and her heart turned over, and he did not hear it, or heard it as a pleasantry, and the moment closed gently over the place where the truth had nearly come out. They cut the lavender and bound it in sheaves with twine, and the gardeners carried it up to hang in the still-room to dry, head down from the beams, so that for a fortnight the whole north passage of the house smelled of it. And Lady Sophie taught Eleanor a country dance in the morning room before the floors were scrubbed. The 3 of them, for the Duke was hauled in to make the third, and was very bad at it, treading and apologizing and counting under his breath, and grew by slow degrees less bad, and then, unexpectedly, gravely good. There was a great deal of laughing. The bare boards rang under them, and the sun came in long and dusty through the tall windows. And once, turning under his raised arm in the figure, Eleanor looked up and found him looking down at her, with no squint in his eyes at all. None. Only a kind of astonished gladness, as though he had set down the wardrobe at the top of the hill without noticing, and found the view worth the climb. "When the lavender's dry," he said to her that evening on the terrace, watching the swifts cut their high circles in the last of the light, perfectly easy, "we shall send a sheaf to Combe Hollow for the Muse child's cradle. They say it keeps the moth off and brings sweet sleep. And next year we shall plant the upper terrace too, and you shall tell me when to cut it, and I shall pretend I knew all along." He said it lightly. He said it as a man says a thing he has stopped doubting. Next year, and the year after, and you in all of them. He said it as though their life together were a settled country he had a map of and meant to live in. And Eleanor stood beside her husband in the warm August dusk, with the dried lavender sweet on the air from the open still-room window, and his easy voice making her a future. And she was happier than she had been in her whole life. And underneath the happiness, like a stone under still water, lay the certain knowledge that Mr. Vane was somewhere choosing his moment, and that this terrace, this dusk, this man saying next year, was the precise and measured weight of what she had to lose. "Yes," she said, "next year." And she took his hand, and he let her, and the swifts went screaming up into the last of the light. Mr. Vane chose the Ashcombe Ball. It was the great gathering of that end of the summer, the last grand squeeze before the county scattered to its harvests. 200 candles and the whole neighborhood crammed into the long saloon at Ashcombe Park, the heat of the bodies and the wax beating up against the heat of the night, so that the open windows gave no relief, only the smell of the dark garden and the moths blundering in to spin round the flames. The Duke and Duchess of Rydale must be seen there, of course, newlywed, the curiosity of the season. Eleanor wore deep amber silk that Lady Sophie had bullied her into, and the colour was right, and she came down the great stair on her husband's arm into the candlelight, and the heat, and the turning heads, and for an hour it was very nearly a triumph. She danced with a bishop and a baronet, and a boy of 18, scarlet to his ears. She heard her own laugh come easy. Julian stood by a pillar and watched her across the floor, with the look of a man who has stopped pretending to himself. And once, when she passed near, he said under the music, "You are enjoying this," in a tone of pure discovery. And she said, "I am enjoying that you are," and went on, and did not look back to see what it did to his face, because she could feel it doing something, and that was enough. Then, near 11, in a lull between the dances, when the fiddlers were resining their bows and the floor stood half empty and shining, Selwyn Vane crossed it to where the Duke stood with Eleanor and a knot of county worthies. He had in his hand a small packet of letters tied with faded tape. His pale face was full of the gravest, kindest concern. And Eleanor knew the moment had come, and she felt the floor of her stomach drop very quietly away. "Your Grace," Vane said, pitching it just so, not loud, never loud, but clear enough that the nearest dozen ears all turned. "Forgive me. I would not, for the world, raise such a matter here. But my conscience as your father's man of business, as your family's faithful servant, will not let me hold my peace while you are deceived in your own house." "Vane! It concerns the Duchess. It concerns how this marriage came to be." He let it hang. The fiddlers had gone quiet. The dozen ears have become 2 dozen. "Your late father's last letters, Your Grace, from Bath. I think you have never read them. I think you should." "Whatever this is," the Duke said, and his voice had gone dangerous and low. It is not for a ballroom, and you know it, which is precisely why you have chosen one. But Vane was already turning a little, taking in his audience. Gentle, relentless. A man performing reluctance to perfection.
There was a woman at Bath, he said, who attached herself to your father in his final illness.
He paused, exactly long enough.
A person of no fortune and less family. A merchant's ruined daughter, in service. She read to him. She flattered him. She made herself, by slow degrees, necessary to a lonely, failing, frightened old man.
Another pause. The candles guttered in a draught from the window, and a woman's fan stopped moving. And within a season she had so worked upon his gratitude and his weakness that he rewrote the whole disposition of his house and bound his son and heir by a clause sworn over a sickbed to marry her. The word sickbed went through the listening crowd like a dropped glass. Eleanor heard it travel, ear to ear, the small indrawn breaths. I have the letters in his own hand, Vane went on. E, he calls her. I have the codicil. I have the dates. Your Grace, I am more sorry than I can say. But the woman you married did not come to this house by your father's free choosing. She engineered it. She has played a long and patient game, and she has won it. And you are the prize. He let his pale gaze rest at last full on Eleanor's face, for all the room to follow. And you did not even know that the name in those letters was hers, until I told you, here, now, in this room. He spread his hands, the soul of regret. Ask her. Ask the Duchess whether she was ever at Bath. Ask her whether she is E. Watch her face. And the whole saloon, 200 candles and 200 faces, turned to watch Eleanor's face. She felt Julian turn too. She felt him turn beside her, slow, and she made herself look up at him, and she saw the squint come back into the slate-grey eyes, the old, decided thing reasserting itself with terrible speed, but worse now, infinitely worse, because for 9 days there had been no squint at all, and so its return had the force of a slammed door. She saw him reach, behind his eyes, for the warm, certain country he had been making, next year, and you in all of them. And she saw the country catch and burn. Were you at Bath? He said, quietly, to her, in front of all of them. With my father, that last winter. Yes. There was no other word. I was. Are you E? I am. She saw it land. She saw it go all the way down, and she opened her mouth to say the rest. I would have told you. I tried to tell you. He chose me because I was kind to him, and for no other reason on this earth. But some fool of a musician took the silence for a cue, and drew his bow across the strings, and the dance struck up, brisk and bright and obscene, and Vane was already turning to the room with his sorrowful, beautiful face. And her husband had stepped back from her one pace. Only one, but it was the whole width of the world. And she understood that no one in that saloon could hear her now over the sound of the worst thing being believed. She did not weep at Ashcombe. She got through the rest of it on the strength 3 years of ruin had laid down in her like a second skeleton. She stood. She let the carriage be called. She let Lady Sophie, white-faced and shaking with a fury too large for 19, take her arm and walk her the length of the saloon under the eyes. She got down the steps and into the dark of the Rydale carriage, without giving Mr. Vane the single tear that would have crowned his evening. That much she could still do. That much no one could take from her. And she held on to the doing of it the way she had held on to worse, hand over hand. It was in the carriage, in the dark, on the long road home, that the cold came up through her. The Duke sat across from her and did not speak, and did not look at her. The carriage lamps swung, and the leather creaked, and the hooves were steady on the chalk road. The hedgerows went by black against a sky still faintly warm at its edge,
and the smell of the cut hay came in at the window, sweet and indifferent. And somewhere, a vixen screamed once in a wood, and was still. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her amber silk, and let herself, for the first time, believe what had happened. He had married her for the bond, and now he believed she had engineered the bond. So he believed that everything, the ledgers, the fever night at Coombe Hollow, the broken hand he had made jokes about, the lavender, the country dance, next year and you in all of them, that all of it had been the same long, patient game played upon the son as the schemer had played it upon the father. He had never then chosen her at all. He had been managed into the chapel and managed through the summer, and the warmth she had thought she felt growing in him had been nothing, in his eyes, but the slow, successful working of her trap. In the only eyes that now mattered, she was exactly the thing Vane had drawn. And the worst of it, the very worst, was that she could see precisely how it looked, and could not unsee it. A ruined woman sits at a rich old man's sickbed and comes away the mistress of his house. There was the story. It needed only a little ink, Vane had said, and he had been right. He had been right about the quantity of ink, to the drac. He had not asked her how it had been. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the swing of the lamps. In all that saloon, he had asked her 2 questions. Were you there? Are you E? And both were questions whose answers Vane already held. He had not asked the third, the only one that mattered, the one whose answer was hers alone. Was it as he says? He had not asked it because he no longer wanted her answer. He had decided. A man who has decided a thing will spend a great deal of ingenuity not noticing the evidence against it. And she had taught him nothing all summer, if not that. And now he was spending the whole of that hard-won ingenuity on her. You might have told me, he said once into the dark, very low, not looking at her. I tried. In the study, over your father's book. I lost my nerve, because I knew it would look like this. She kept her own voice even, which cost her more than weeping would have done. I see I was right to be afraid of it. That is a poor comfort to us both. He said nothing more. The carriage turned in at the avenue, and the wheels changed their note on the gravel. And Eleanor looked at the black shape of him against the faintly warm window, and thought, with a calm that frightened her, I will be gone before the lavender is taken down from the still room. She had survived a jilting and a ruin, and 3 years of other people's sick rooms. She had survived worse than a cold man in a swinging carriage. She would survive this, because surviving was the one thing she had never yet failed to do, even when she had wished, in the small hours, that she might be let off it just once. She went up to her room, and she did not ring for the maid, and she took out her own small box, the box that had come with her into this house, that held everything that was truly hers, which was not much. And she set it on the bed in the candlelight, and she began, very steadily, to decide what in this great warm house was hers to take, and what she would leave. She found that the answer was almost nothing. She had brought almost nothing, and almost nothing was hers. And in the morning she would be almost nothing again. The grey riverstone from the windowsill, the half sheet about the chimneys, the burn scar on her palm, which was hers, and would go with her wherever she went. The lavender would go to Coombe Hollow without her, and that was the end of the story she had let herself begin to tell. The window stood open to the summer night. Down the dark length of the south walk, the cut stems of the lavender stood headless in their rows, and the scent of the cropped plants came up faint and bruised on the night air. And somewhere in the stable, a horse shifted and was still. She was at the writing desk before dawn, in the cold grey hour, the candle burned to a guttering stub, composing the short, civil note that would tell him she had gone to her aunt's and would trouble him for nothing, when she heard, through the open window, the gravel. A carriage, very early,
very fast. The hooves coming hard up the avenue and the wheels skidding small stones. And then voices below, the under-butlers, raised and shocked at being roused. And over it, a smooth, pale voice she knew. A voice made for the saying of reasonable, ruinous things. Eleanor was at the window in time to see, in the first grey light, Mr. Selwyn Vane handed down onto the gravel for the second time in a fortnight, with a leather case under his arm, and the sight of him drove every thought of flight clean out of her head. He had not come to gloat. He had come to finish it. A schemer driven out is a wound that may heal. A schemer driven out and stripped of her widow's portion, her settlements, her very name struck from the disposition of the house. That is a thing that cannot heal. And Vane was a man of business, and he had come early, before the house was up, before she could rally, to lay before the Duke the papers that would unmake her entirely, while the unmaking was easy and unwitnessed. She did not finish the note. She blew out the dying candle and went down. She came into the library in her travelling dress, with her hair plainly done, and the long room was full of the first grey light and the cold of a hearth not lit. And they were both already there. Julian stood by the empty fireplace, grey-faced, in last night's shirt, looking as though he had not been to bed. Vane sat at the great desk as though it were already his leather case open, papers fanned across the leather, the faded tape-tied letters at his elbow, the whole machinery of her ruin spread out and catching the dawn, and so the codicil falls of its own weight. Vane was saying, smooth, fluent, building it stone on stone. The moment undue influence is shown, and undue influence is, I think your grace will agree, written in every line of these letters. The duchess's settlements were charged upon that codicil. Strike the one, and the other cannot stand. It is hard, your grace, I know it is hard. But you were imposed upon, and your father was imposed upon, and the law provides a remedy for exactly such impositions, and I have taken the liberty of drawing up the necessary— Mr. Vane, Eleanor said from the door, what a great deal of trouble you have gone to part a frightened old man from the one person who was kind to him at the end. They both turned. Vane recovered first, he always would. Your Grace, I had hoped to spare you this interview. I am sure you had. She came into the room. She did not look at Julian, she could not yet afford to. She looked at the letters fanned on the desk, the small, slanting brown ink hand she would have known among 10,000. And she felt, looking at them, not fear at last, but a great, clean, rising anger. The anger of a woman watching a man handle a thing he has no right to touch. You have his letters. You have read them aloud to half the county. Tell me, Mr. Vane, have you read them all? Every one? To the very last? The smallest flicker. I have his correspondence entire. A man of business. Keeps everything. Yes, you said. She turned finally to her husband, and she made herself meet the slate-gray eyes that would not quite meet hers. And she spoke to him only, as though the room held no one else, and the gray light held no one else, and there were only the two of them, and a thing that had to be put into his hand. Your father wrote to his man of business about his accounts, and his codicil, and his E. Of course he did. But he wrote to you, too, Your Grace, at the end. She watched his face. He wrote you a letter, and gave it into my hand, in Mrs. Cobbold's front room in Trim Street, on a cold afternoon in February, with the fog white at the window, and the fire too small to warm him. He made me promise to keep it until I judged the moment right, and then to give it you myself. I have kept it 6 months. I have kept it in this house all summer. Her voice did not break, though it bent. I did not give it because, God help me, I was waiting for the moment to be right. And the moment was never right. And now there is no right moment left. So you shall have it wrong. She drew it from inside her bodice, where she had carried it since she left her room. A single folded sheet, much creased, the seal long broken, gone soft as cloth at the folds from 6 months against her skin. And she crossed the room and laid it down on the desk in front of Julian. On the leather, within his reach. Square over the top of Vane's fanned and ruinous papers. "Read it," she said. "You will know his hand. Mr. Vane has shown it you enough this fortnight." For a long moment no one moved. The first true sun came level through the east window and lay across the desk and lit the dust in the air. Vane had gone very still, the stillness of a card player who has seen, too late, the trick he did not know was out. Julian picked up the letter. His hands were not quite steady. He unfolded it along its soft, worn creases, and Eleanor watched his eyes go to the hand and know it, and watched them begin to move down the lines, and she knew the lines by heart, for she had read them to herself in the dark of too many nights. His face, as he read, did a thing she had no name for, came apart and was remade, and he read one part of it aloud without seeming to know that he did, his voice gone rough and low in the quiet room. "And if she will have a graceless boy who has never once come to Bath to see his father, then I have left you the best thing I had to leave, better than the house, for the house is only stone, and she is the kindest creature God ever set down in a cold lodging to keep a foolish old man company. Marry her, Julian, not because I bid you, but because I have watched her, and I would have you watched over so." He stopped. He could not go on. He put the back of his hand to his mouth and held it there, and the sun lay across the broken seal. "There is no undue influence in that letter, Mr. Vane," Eleanor said, very quietly, into the silence. "There is only an old man who was lonely and afraid, and a woman who read to him, and argued with him about his garden, and told him to leave the bee his share, and who never once asked him for a farthing, who did not know until this fortnight that there was any codicil at all, let alone settlements charged upon it." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I did not want his house. I did not know I was to have it. I wanted only that he should not be afraid in the nights, and by the end he was not. And that is the whole of my long, patient game, Mr. Vane. And you may publish it in the Morning Chronicle if you think it will pay." Julian Bardell set the letter down on the desk. He looked at it, his father's hand bright in the morning sun. And then he turned to Mr. Selwyn Vane, and the grief went out of his face, and something else came into it, cold and absolutely level, the altar voice made flesh. And Eleanor saw at last what her husband was when he was not carrying the wardrobe up the hill. She saw the whole formidable weight of him come down in one direction. "You knew of this letter," he said. It was not a question. "Your Grace, I could not have known what a private—" "You knew my father wrote to me at the end. You keep everything. You have said so twice this morning, like a man who cannot help confessing." The Duke came a slow step toward the desk. "You knew there was a letter to me in another hand than yours, and you came to me with the letters that served your purpose, and not the one that did not. You let me stand in the Ashcombe saloon." His voice did not rise. It went, if anything, quieter, and the quiet was worse than any shout. "You let me wound my wife in front of 200 people. To keep the running of an estate, you have been bleeding £11 a quarter through a chimney that does not need mending. Get out of my house." "Your Grace, the codicil. The question of the settlements remains a matter of law, and as your man of business, I am bound to—" "You are not my man of business. You have not been my man of business since the moment you crossed my drawing room and called my wife indispensable, as though it were a charge read out at the assizes." He set one hand flat on the fanned papers. "My solicitors, my new solicitors, will wait upon you within the week to examine every account you have touched in 12 years, beginning with the chimneys and working outward." He looked at the man over the desk, and the sun was full on him now. I think, Mr. Vane, that you had very much better be on the Bath Road before they begin, because I do not believe the chimneys are the only fiction in your books, and I am no longer a man who declines to read the part of the page no one reads. My wife taught me to read it. You taught her, you said. You should have taught her less well, or yourself more honestly. Now go. Vane went. He gathered his ruinous papers with hands that had lost their card player's steadiness, the tape slipping, a letter fluttering to the boards and snatched up, and his beautiful marble face had cracked at last into something merely frightened and small. He went out past Eleanor without a word, and without meeting her eye, the cold, clean smell of him going by her like the memory of winter, and a moment later, the gravel sounded again, fast, and then faded down the avenue, and was gone. And the library was full of level, early sun, and the two of them, and the soft, creased letter on the desk. Julian stood with his back to her for a long moment, his head bent over his father's hand. When he turned, the coldness had gone out of him entirely, and left only a man, tired and undefended, with his father's letter in his sight, and his summer in ruins of a different making. I stepped back from you, he said, in the saloon. 1 pace. I have been standing in that 1 pace all night. He came no nearer yet. I asked you whether you were there, and whether you were E, and I did not ask you whether it was as he said. I know. She did not move toward him either. Some things must be walked the whole way alone, or they are not worth the walking. I sat across from you in the carriage, and I knew exactly which question you had not asked, and I knew why you had not asked it. Tell me why. I am not sure I know it myself. Because you were afraid of the answer. She held his eyes. Not afraid I had schemed. Afraid I had not. He let out a breath, as though she had struck him gently in the chest, and the signet turned once on his finger, around and back, and stopped. Yes, he said. God help me, yes. He came toward her now, slowly, across the bars of sun. Afraid that you were exactly what my father said you were, the kindest creature God ever set down, and that I had married you in resentment and warned you at the altar that you would regret me, and spent the whole summer being managed, as I thought, into loving you, and would now have to live the rest of my life knowing that the best thing ever to come into my house came by a sick-room clause and a stranger's pity, and not 1 inch of it by my own choosing. That was what I was afraid of, Eleanor. Not that you were false. That you were true, and that I had had no hand in it and deserved none. And now? Now. He stopped in front of her. The sun was on his face, and the white scar through his eyebrow, and the slate-grey eyes that had no squint in them at all. None. Now I find I cannot let it stand by a clause either. My father chose you. Very well. He was right, as he was right in most things. He will tell you so. A breath that was nearly a laugh, and nearly not. But I will not be a man who was given his wife. He reached past her, and she heard in the next room Mrs. Pell with the breakfast things, the small, honest clink of crockery, and through the window Lady Sophie's voice calling something across the wet lawn to a dog, the whole warm machinery of the house starting up around them as though it were any morning. And he took up his father's letter from the desk, the soft, creased sheet, and he held it a moment in both hands. Then, deliberately, he folded it once more along its 6-month creases, and put it into Eleanor's hand, and closed her fingers over it with his own. This is yours, he said. He gave it to you to give to me, and you have done it, and your promise is kept, and your charge discharged. His hand stayed warm over hers. And the codicil, and the settlements, and the whole legal architecture of how we came to be married. I renounce it. All of it. In front of you, with no 200 people to perform for. There is no bond on me now, Eleanor. There is no clause, no codicil, no father's hand. He drew a breath. There is only a man standing in his library on an August morning, telling his wife, of his own entire and unforced choosing, that he does not in the least regret her, that he has not regretted her since a cold spring in a fevered village, that he intends to plant the upper terrace next year and the year after, and to be told by her exactly when to cut it for the rest of his natural life. The sun lay between them on the boards, and asking her, with nothing left to make her stay but the asking, whether she will have him. Not the Duke, not the house. Me, such as I am. Will you? The letter was soft in her hand, and his hand was warm over it. The lavender came faint and bruised through the open window from the cropped rose below. And Eleanor Hartwell, who had survived a jilting and a ruin, and 3 years of other people's sick rooms, and one cold winter in Trim Street keeping a frightened old man company in the nights, looked up at the man who had at last asked her the only question that was hers alone to answer, and found that the answer cost her nothing after all, and was the easiest thing she had ever said. "I will," she said. "Though I warn you, Your Grace, you told me once I would regret this." She put her free hand flat against his chest over the hard, quick beat of him, and she smiled. And this time it was the other smile, the one she had never yet given anyone. "I have regretted a great many things. I do not mean to add you to the list. See, you give me no cause." "I shall spend my life at it," he said, and bent his head, and kissed her in the level morning sun, with his father's letter pressed soft between their 2 hands. And through the door, Mrs. Pell, coming in with the chocolate and finding them so, set the tray down without a clatter on the side table, and went out again as quietly as she had come, and remarked to the empty hall, to no one, to the portraits, to the long line of Bardels who had been raised in that house and gone to their rest out of it, that she had buried 2 masters and a mistress, and raised this one out of a cedar tree with a broken collarbone, roaring the place down, and had begun, against all expectation and at her time of life, to think the boy might do. The lavender went to Combe Hollow after all, in the end of that August, a great sweet sheaf of it for the Muse child's cradle, to keep the moth off and bring sweet sleep. And Eleanor carried it down herself in the gig with the Duke driving, the 2 of them, on a morning gold with the first turn of the year toward harvest, the stubble pale in the cut fields, and the swallows already gathering on the wires. They planted the upper terrace the next spring, as he had said, and Eleanor told him when to cut it, on the 2nd dry day after midsummer, and he pretended he had known all along. Lady Sophie came home from her first London season unbetrothed and triumphant, and full of scandal, and helped them gather it, her ribbons trailing in the rows, and Mrs. Pell allowed, crushing a spike between her fingers and putting it to her nose, that the new terrace did very well, considering, which from Mrs. Pell was a Te Deum sung in full. The old Duke's garden book lived now on the table in the south study, open most often at the lavender plate, and the brittle grey-purple sprig still lay pressed in the gutter where he had kept it, and beside it, slipped between the leaves, lay a soft, much-creased letter that Eleanor had read aloud to Julian once, all of it, every line, on a winter evening by the fire, with the rain on the glass, so that he should have heard his father's whole voice, and not only the part another man had chosen for him. He had not stepped back from her again. He had learned, instead, the trick of stepping nearer. On a warm evening, at the very end of the lavender's 2nd summer, they stood together at the foot of the South Walk in the amber dusk. The swifts were screaming up into the high gold air. The cut stems stood headless in their rows, and the whole drowsy, resinous sweetness of the place rose round them as the heat went out of the day, and the gravel gave its warmth back through the soles of her feet. He had his arm about her. She had her bare feet on the warm gravel and her slippers in her hand, exactly as on a wedding night 2 summers gone. And she was thinking of it, and she knew, by the stillness of him, that he was too. "I told you," he said, against her hair, low, that you would regret this. You did. She leaned back into the warm breadth of him and watched the last bee work the last unshorn spike at the end of the row, taking, at her insistence, his share. You were so very sure of it, Your Grace. You stood at the rail and warned me off, as though you were the worst thing that ever befell a woman.
And was I?
She turned in his arm and looked up at him, at the white scar and the slate-grey eyes gone soft with the evening, at the grave mouth that had learned, at last and only with her, to come undone.
Not even close,
she said, and reached up and kissed him. And far down the warm walk, the last bee lifted off the lavender at last, and went home heavy through the gold.